Hello, I'm Bob Wise, representative for the 3rd District. You know, in the 4 years I've been in office, I've seen a lot of changes in federal funding. And indeed, what you're doing today is very, very important for the state of West Virginia, and that is finding alternate sources of funding. Because let's face it, some of the programs that once existed 4 to 6, 7 years ago no longer exist. Those are federal programs to which one would apply for grants in order to further a project. Other programs, in fact far many more, have been greatly cut back. I take the Appalachian Regional Commission or the Economic Development Administration as an example. And in this day of Grain-Rudman and budget cuts, it becomes much more difficult sometimes to find the federal funds that are so vital to carry on the projects that we need. And so we turn to private foundations, which are often overlooked. And indeed they shouldn't be. So as you're now into learning about private grants and private foundations, I just want to urge you to keep your mind open to look for all sources of funding, including these, what I call alternate sources of funding to the federal government. You know, there's possibilities in those foundations. Let's take a look at some statistics. For instance, there are approximately 26,000 foundations today in the United States. And those foundations have assets of over $34 billion. $34 billion to be applied for. And so we must look to those. Indeed, we have no choice. Now, of course, you want to target what you're looking for. Some foundations are up your alley, some aren't. And it's important to note that of the 24 or 26,000 that I mentioned, 3,000 of those foundations control about 92% of all assets and make about 82% of the grants. And so that brings your world down a little smaller as to whom you're focusing on. You have to be persistent, and sometimes you have to understand the shortcomings of a foundation. A lot of foundations are very small operations. They have assets, they make grants, they make awards, but they have limited resources to work with. For instance, only 800 of the foundations I've been talking about employ one or more full-time persons. Once again, you're going to have to be persistent, you're going to have to call back, you're going to have to work with that foundation, trying to determine exactly what its needs are. I think it's important to note that many areas of the country aren't really either being considered or are not taking advantage of what foundations have to offer. Statistics tell us that more than 50% of all foundation grants are received in just a few areas: New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the District of Columbia. Now, why can't that be West Virginia, too? There's absolutely no reason. I think if we put forward an effort, if we put forward good, concrete, solid, and substantial grant proposals, then it could well be West Virginia. And indeed, that's one of the most important areas to focus on, is putting together that good grant proposal. Because, and I speak as one who, before I was elected to public office, worked for 3 years on a project, a public interest project founded by a private foundation. And so I know the importance of putting together that grant application, because that grant application was in competition with literally hundreds of others. And so to be noticed, to jump out of that stack, you have to make sure that it's accurate, correct, it's what they're looking for, and indeed maybe has a little something extra. Now, do foundations have to give? Yes, they have to give. But the federal law requires that foundations give at least 5% of their assets, or an amount equal to the year's earnings, whichever is higher. And so there is that requirement in the federal law that requires that a foundation distribute a certain part of its assets. And so that means that each year foundations are giving roughly $3 billion. And so that's money that we can be applying for in West Virginia, whether it be for economic development, or for infrastructure development, or for planning, whatever it is, or perhaps to help administer a program. You know, it's going to be even tougher in days ahead. Federal revenue sharing will cease to exist as we know it in October. And so that source, which many have gone to counties, for instance, or to cities to help them run their projects, that will no longer be there. And of course, there'll be other cutbacks coming in the federal budget. I think it's important to note that the Foundation Center reports that the most serious problem confronted by foundations is the low quality of proposals that they are receiving. And once again, that goes back to getting your foundation or getting your application to that foundation off of the stack, making it stand out. It's crisp, it's concise, It tells the reviewer exactly what he or she wants to hear and to see. And indeed, once again, it has that something extra. You know, of course, it all comes back to computers and getting the right data. And data-based retrieval allows for the accessing of comprehensive information on 22,000 foundations. And happily now in West Virginia, we have access to that database. Mike Robinson is putting that together, and indeed I know has been talking to you about it. And so working with Mike, you'll have access to that vital information you need to make your application the one that stands out. Mike Robinson has done a lot to put this project together. Indeed, in my memory, it's the first ever in this state private sector workshop on seeking private foundation grants. We've had a lot of them on public sector, but this, to my knowledge, is the first one on the private sector. So I congratulate Mike for what he's doing, and particularly congratulate you for attending. You know, I hope that this can become an annual function, this workshop, and indeed that the numbers increase. And so I hope that when you return to your communities, you will spread the word that there are other ways that we can find some of the revenue that we need. You know, that's important and vital to West Virginia. We have to be willing to look at ways that perhaps we haven't before. We have to look at ways that perhaps are not traditional. And indeed, as the world changes, so do we change. And so I encourage you to make the most of this. I know you are, but most importantly, to spread the word on exactly what opportunities are available through foundations. $34 billion is out there in assets, 26,000 foundations. They'll distribute over $3 billion this year. The key is, can some of that money be coming your way? Thank you very much.